And now we'll take a look at the elasticity of supply. The elasticity of supply is very similar in principle to the price elasticity of demand. So basically what we're going to be looking at, if you remember the law of demand says that for the majority of goods and services, the relationship between price and quantity supplied is a positive relationship, and we will see that this produces an upward sloping supply curve. So when the price of a good or service increases, let's say from $9 to $10, what happens to the quantity supplied? Well, if this was the quantity supplied 1, what happens to the quantity supplied? Well, the quantity supply should increase. How much does it increase by? An equal percentage as the change in price? Well, if it does that, then we would be able to say that the elasticity of supply would be unit elastic, just like we saw in price elasticity of demand. If it's equal to 1 or 1.0, we would call that unit elasticity of supply. Okay, so that means that over here to the right, if the number is greater than 1, if the elasticity of supply is greater than 1, then we are going to have an elastic supply curve, and if the elasticity of supply is less than 1, we are going to have an inelastic supply curve. So just looking at the supply curve, we can't be 100% certain what the elasticity of supply is going to be, but we can talk about it in relative terms. If we look at one curve, we learned before that there's a point on that curve where it has unit elasticity, and there's a point of an inelastic and an elastic when we're looking at the demand curve. Well, the same thing holds for the elasticity of supply. Now, if we looked at two curves that shared the same point, let's say this point right here, we can see that we have a relatively, we could even look at a couple different curves that share that point. So this supply curve is more inelastic than this supply curve. Okay, the steeper the curve in general, if they share the same point, if we're comparing relative curves, we can say that this one is more inelastic than this one. So when determining the elasticity of supply, we're going to look at the percent change in quantity supplied divided by the percent change in price. Okay, so this should be very familiar to us at this point. This is going to give us the elasticity of supply. Some of the things that determine the elasticity of supply for a company are things like when there are changes in the price of the per unit production costs as the production increases. So basically, as we increase the quantity supply and firms are increasing the amount that they're producing, what's happening to the slope of that curve? Is it getting steeper? Are the costs getting higher as they increase production costs? We work with a linear supply curve, but remember that in truth, supply curves are often much steeper at higher quantities. Okay, so this is a more relatively accurate supply curve. So again, this is quantity supply. Okay, that's the main determinant of price elasticity of supply is what happens when there are changes in the per unit production costs with increased production. Another thing is the time horizon. Just like price elasticity of demand, the longer the firm has, just like the longer the consumer has, the change in relative elasticities. The third thing that controls a firm's price elasticity of supply is the share of the market for inputs. So I give the example a lot of times about houses using a lot of lumber. So out of all the available lumber in the United States, if there are changes in the price of homes, there are changes in the quantity that are going to be built, and that's going to use a lot of lumber. Let's say that there's a housing boom and the prices of houses are going up and firms are producing more homes, then that's going to take a lot of the resources in our lumber market. So they use a large share of the market for that particular input. Same thing about steel for cars. And then the last thing that determines a firm's elasticity of supply is kind of the geographical scope, we call it. The geographical, not just the geographical area, but in terms of the geographical location, what happens when changes need to happen. So for example, the most commonly used one is what happens if a lot of people move to, let's say, California, and the demand for gasoline goes up significantly. Well, we have a certain supply of gasoline, but we can borrow from our neighbors. We could very easily transport gasoline from Nevada or Oregon or Washington, or even all the way as far as Colorado, to bring more gasoline to California. What happens if the United States in general or the world increases the demand for gasoline? Well, now that's a very much different situation. So in the first situation where it's just California, we can change supply relatively easily and the price isn't going to be affected that much. However, in the global economy, if we have a huge increase and there's not really that many places that we can transport additional gasoline for, then we're going to see that the price is going to be very reactive. Okay, so now let's go ahead and let's kind of clean this up, and we'll go back and look at an example. So we'll look at an example of how to find the price elasticity of supply. So I'm going to do this twice. I'm going to look at once where we look at a change in price going, we'll say going up the curve, because that's what I kind of started off with. So we'll say the original price is $9, and we see that this firm at $9 is making, let's say 150 units. 150 units. And the price of this good increases to $10, and according to their supply schedule, it looks like this firm would increase production and be willing to offer 210 units for sale. Okay, so we're going to use our formula: percent change in quantity supplied divided by percent change and price. So now let's look at what those percent changes are. So we're going from a $9 price and increasing it, moving along our existing curve up to this $10 price. Okay, so we're going to start with the change in quantity supplied. So it went from 150 units to 210 units. So the change there is going to be 60 units, and we'll divide that by our original quantity supplied, which is 150 units. Okay, so if we are looking at the change in price, we see that it's a $1 change, and our original price is $9. So we look at the change in price divided by the original price, which is $9. So 6 goes into 15, and we'll say this is 0.4 or 40%, and 1/9 is 0.1111. So the elasticity of supply here is roughly 3.6. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that 3.6, when we see the elasticity of supply equal to 3.6, that means for every increase in price of 1%, it's going to lead to an increase in quantity supplied of 3.6%. Okay, so for each 1% increase in price, we're going to see that there's a 3.6% decrease in price. Now remember that if we're going up the curve, we're going to get a different elasticity than if we're going down the curve. Okay, a percent change from $1 going up to $9 is roughly 11%, and a $1 change going from $10 down to $9 is obviously 10%. So even though in this example, since I only used a dollar difference, it wouldn't be that great of a difference. But let's look at, it wouldn't be that great of a difference in this number. And a good thing for you to try right now would be, what would the change in elasticity be if we're going down the curve? If the price was $10 and it came down to $9, what would happen to the elasticity of supply? So let's clear that out and do a bigger change. Let's say that we're looking at another example where the price of this good is $10. And at $10, let's say 100 units are produced, to keep it easy. And the price goes up to $20. At $20, moving up the curve, we're going to have a very different number, because if we go from $10 to $20, if we're moving up the curve, that's a much different percent increase. That would be 100% change in price, as opposed to if we're going from $20 down to $10. Here, that's only a 50% change in price. Okay, so obviously that's going to change our elasticity of supply very significantly. So let's go ahead and see that when we have a situation like that, the best thing to do is to say, well, this is the relative range. Okay, we want to find out the elasticity of supply for this overall range. And what we're going to do is we're going to find the elasticity at one exact spot in the middle of that relative range, and we'll call that the midpoint. And in order to find the midpoint elasticity, we can use the midpoint formula, also called the arc elasticity of supply. So to use the arc elasticity or the midpoint formula, what we're going to do is we're going to look at, I need to give us a second number here. Let's say that it goes up to 110 units. Okay, so to use the midpoint formula, we're going to look at the change in quantity divided by the average quantity over the change in price divided by the average price. Okay, so this will make it so it doesn't matter if we're going up the scale or down the scale. A firm could hire us and say, hey, we're looking at the different pricing options we have between $10 and $20. Can you give us an idea of what our total revenue would be if we changed by $1 in this area? And you could say, sure, I could figure out the elasticity of supply over that relative range, and then we'd be able to tell what's happening to total revenue, because we'd be able to see if you increase your price by 1%, how much is quantity supplied going to change by. Okay, so let's go ahead and check out how this would work. Okay, so in this example, we're going to look at the change in quantity. So we're going to start off with 110 units, and so that's our quantity 1, or our quantity 2, sorry, and then we'll subtract to our quantity 1. So basically we see that the difference there is 10. Okay, so we'll do this in a couple steps to make sure that I don't lose anybody. And then we need to find our average price. Well, we can all see what the average is. It's 105. But how do we find an average? Well, we simply add these two things together and then divide it by 2. Okay, so we can see that it is actually 105. Okay, so it's the change in quantity divided by the average quantity over the change in price. So the price change is from $20 to $10 or $10 to $20. It doesn't matter which way we're looking at this. So since we started with Q2, we'll go ahead and put P2 first. So we can think of this as P1, P2, Q1 corresponds with P1, and Q2 corresponds with P2. Okay, so we can look at this as $20 minus $10, which we know is going to be $10 of a price difference, over the average price. Well, what's the average price? Well, the average price would be $20 plus $10 divided by 2. Okay, or we can see that the average price is obviously right there, $15. So basically $15 and 105 units. So $10 divided by $15. Okay, so what do we have here? We would see we would see that 10 divided by 105 is going to be 95%, so 0.95. And 10 divided by $15, so $10 divided by $15 is roughly 2/3, or is 2/3, so roughly 0.667. So that means that our elasticity of supply is 0.143. Okay, so 0.143. If we were to look at going up the scale and going down the scale, we would end up with a number that's very different than 0.143. So what does that mean? Well, that means for every 1% increase in price, quantity supplied will increase by almost 1.5%. Okay, 1.43%. Okay, so overall, the elasticity of supply is very, very similar to the elasticity of demand. Obviously, different sides of the market, but overall, we see a lot of similarities in the price elasticity of demand. Obviously, not the income elasticity of demand or cross price elasticity of demand. So this is the last chapter this is the last video for this chapter. This chapter is a very difficult chapter. It's very math based. And all we've done is kind of start to break the surface on this. Please, please, please make sure you use your workbook a lot to work out some of these harder mathematical problems and really see the application, because we're going to be going over that on the exam. All of the answers are in the back of the book. I've done these things step by step to walk you through it and make sure that you're understanding how to use it. It's really just basic math, very, very basic math, the difference divided by 2, finding the average, but you need to make sure that you practice this a lot in order to understand how to do it.